Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Happy Thursday to you, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to the last Thursday Talk webinar of 2019, of the decade, and possibly forever. I'm just kidding, It's not, we're going to be back in 2020. And I know that you're all laughing into your muted microphones right now, so I think my one hope for 2020 is that I get a laugh track installed on GoToWebinar so I can feel like you guys are all in the room laughing with me and not at me. Just in case you've forgotten, and for those of you that are new to DME for Peace, my name is Jack Farrell and I am the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground based in London. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Khalil Bitar, who is the EvalYouth Global Network's chair and leader of EvalMENA, to the Thursday talks. And Khalil is going to lead a discussion on evaluators as activists, the role of evaluators in protecting and promoting social justice and equality. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once you reach the Q&A. I'm now going to hand over to today's guest. Khalil, you are very welcome to the Thursday Talks. Please feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much, Jack. I just want to make sure if you hear me very well, it's good. The
Coming
quality?
through loud and clear.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me and for DME for Peace for the great opportunity to connect with all colleagues here today and discuss, in my opinion, very crucial and timely topic. Should evaluators be activists too? Evaluators' role in protecting and promoting social justice and equity. Good morning and good afternoon and evening to all colleagues joining us today. Thank you so much for dedicating part of your Thursday to this webinar just before the holidays, during very busy time, I'm sure, for all of you. My name is Khalil Bitar. I am an evaluator from Palestine and the chair of EvalYouth, the global network for young and emerging evaluators. I am currently completing my PhD in Germany, focusing on evaluation in conflict-affected and fragile countries, but currently actually connecting with you from Jordan, Amman, where we just concluded with the first evaluation winter school for young and emerging evaluators from the Middle East and North Africa, MENA region. I will present for about 20 minutes, but very much looking for your contribution, interaction in the chat box, as Jack said, and hopefully we can discuss afterwards your questions and comments, and I'm looking forward for that. Dear colleagues, this is how we are ending the first decade of the 21st century. The richest 1% owns 45% of the global wealth. This is how the 10 richest men's wealth when compared to certain countries. And here, this is how the world's poorest wealth has been shrinking compared to the billionaires' wealth from 2009 to 2018. We are truly living in a global inequality crisis, and it's not getting any better. Perhaps a good manifestation of how we are ending this decade is this: a piece of art with a banana duct taped to a wall, which sold two so far, each for staggering $120,000, and third to be sold for another $150,000. But this general trend of, if I may call it, madness, is not only affecting the present human inhabitants of the earth, but also future generation and other inhabitants that we share the earth with. Here, how we are ending the first decade of the 21st century, environmentally speaking. Every year, an estimated 2.2 billion tons of waste is dumped into our oceans. In just one generation, our production of man-made chemicals increased by 40,000% from 1 million to 400 billion tons, and approximately 9 million people die from pollution each year. In the last 200 years, we have added 2.3 trillion tons of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. Half of this amount was added in just the last 30 to 35 years. The UN Intergovernmental Report on Climate Change projects that by 2030 is roughly the year or the time when global warming will reach irreversible tipping point. And in terms of loss of biodiversity, the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources estimates that the present rate of extinction may be up to 140,000 species per year. We are reaching a point of no return on both fronts discussed earlier and several other fronts. Something needs to happen. Business as usual is not enough, but both the staggering global inequality and environmental crisis, like many other major challenges facing our world today, are not inevitable. Speaking to young and emerging evaluators during the 4th EvalYouth virtual conference last month, Michael Quinn-Batten, as he explains in his really wonderful newly released book titled Blue Marble Evaluation Premises and Principles, stresses that we are the first generation to know we are destroying our planet, and the last one that can do anything about it. Recently, I had the pleasure to speak at the American Evaluation Association's conference in Minneapolis, where I highlighted general trends about young evaluators and how they work, drawing on my experience working with many young and emerging evaluators from various countries and regions. I've highlighted this one trend that I thought is very important, that young evaluators are not shying away from putting on their activist hat along with their evaluator hat. Many young evaluators I work with tend to be less drawn to the idea of being completely impartial or neutral in this sense. For example, many young evaluators in Palestine, where I come from, are striving to give voice to the often unheard segments of the society, and indeed reach members of the society that many interventions cannot, for example, in the Gaza Strip and other parts of the country, whether because of the conflict or neglect by government. And young evaluators in the MENA region, in general, are focusing on the democratic transition and Arab Spring revolutions, led by youth which witnessed different levels of success across the region. In Europe, many evaluators are advocating for enhanced environmental awareness and action responding to the climate crisis. And in the US, many young evaluators are focusing on issues related to social justice, gender equality, and racial equity. If we speak about youth, not only young and emerging evaluators, youth around the world are sparking, leading, and taking a highly active role in multiple socio-political grassroots movements, advocating for enhanced social justice, equity, equality, environmental sustainability, peace, and several other right-based and forward-looking critical issues. Young evaluators carry and act upon these very principles and values. They often are activists or leaders in many of these social movements. But even when they're not directly linked to these movements, they connect to them through social media and other means, which many of these social movements and young evaluators capitalize very effectively. Young evaluators also are building stronger alliances with other social justice and equity-focused groups and networks in evaluation activism field. For example, EvalYouth has established strong and sustained connections with EvalGender Plus, EvalIndigenous, as well as EvalSDGs, the Global Parliamentarian Forums, and similar groups and networks. In carrying out this work, young evaluators are not methodologically dogmatic. More often than not, they tend to embrace mixed methods, contextually responsive approaches, and understand that rigor is not the property of technical methods, but rather of evaluative thinking. Many of these points and more are further discussed in the recent published Ideas book titled Evaluation for Transformative Change, which is available online. The chapter I co-authored with my EvalYouth colleagues focuses primarily on young and emerging evaluators. But what about evaluation community overall? Can evaluators play an active role as activists beyond the limitation of the traditional view that tells us that an evaluator should always be impartial and never express her or his opinion in her or his evaluation work beyond the boundaries of the evaluation project's specific task and scope of work, or perhaps TOR? To help us answer this question, we go back to Michael Quimbatten and the book Blue Marble Evaluation. To me, the book presents a wake-up call to all evaluators in many different ways, but especially in the topic we are discussing today. After explaining the world we live in and the risk we are facing, Patton emphasizes that evaluators are not outsiders. Themselves, their families, and their communities are affected by what we see and what we experience. He stresses on the need to transform evaluation in order to evaluate transformation, which is a central argument to the book and as one of the many principles or overarching principles in the book. The crux of the Blue Marble Evaluation perspective, in my view, is liberating readers, chiefly but certainly not exclusively evaluators, from the unevaluative thinking and the boundaries and silos that come with this type of thinking. It offers a holistic approach that looks beyond the boundaries of nation states, sees the local in the light of the global and vice versa, and deconstructs predefined boundaries between sectors, issues, methods, and so on. Patton also calls on evaluators to engage and understand the realities of Anthropocene and use evaluative thinking and evaluation processes to contribute to more sustainable and equitable human ecosystem trajectories. But he states that it's not all doom and gloom. And I'm hoping that I am not conveying this message. By examining the state of the world generates urgent calls for transformation, yes, but as well as beacons of hope. He sees evaluation as transdisciplinary global profession that has much to offer in navigating the risk and opportunities that arise as global challenges, initiatives, and interventions are designed and undertaken to ensure more sustainable and equitable future. This evaluative thinking and action, perhaps, approach is something I quickly noticed that I needed when I started working as an evaluator in Palestine 10 years ago. Many of the issues we are discussing today are more urgent and dire in conflict-affected zones. After a few years, I wrote this article titled Evaluation Under Occupation, the role of evaluators in protecting and promoting social justice and equality in conflict-affected and fragile countries, with the case of the occupied Palestinian territory as the case study. In the article, I highlight efforts by evaluators in Palestine to look beyond the traditional evaluation criteria and methods and actively advocate for social justice issues. Unfortunately, however, till the moment, and to the best of my knowledge, evaluator competencies as set by many different evaluation associations, institutions, networks, tend to not pay enough attention to these issues. To me, every evaluator has the responsibility to strive to protect and promote social justice and equity and environmental sustainability, I may say, wherever she or he works, backed with data, evidence, and the critical lens we see the world with. But you may ask, why? Why us? Here are some rationales that I see explain why us. First, because we care. A lot of us came to this field because we have this care and we want to change things. Second, that we see our role as speaking truth to power, and we often see this in many of the discussions about evaluation. We have privilege and hence ethical responsibility. A lot of us are using the computer now to connect. We have educational degrees. We live surely more than $5 a day. So a lot of us also, not maybe in the 1% percentile, but maybe in the 10, 15, I don't know, but we have a lot of privilege that also make us responsible. But we also have advantage that we are systematic and have proper tools and methodology, and we have a field that for 50 years has been developing in this regard. Many of us as well are in the place to change because we have critical positions in our organizations and in our institutions where we are based. So this gives us even more responsibility, I think, for change. And we are the now and the future. Specifically this point, I express it when I talk with young and emerging evaluators, that they are the now and the future. And if we don't do something about this, who else will do? But some of you might ask how, because we talked a lot about, the rationale for it, but how to do the change. I will highlight a few lessons learned from my experience and those offered in the discussed literature that I presented. But I want to first recommend those two excellent publications on the matter for future reading, if you are interested. One is called How to Design and Manage Equity-Focused Evaluation by Michael Bamberger and Michael Bamberger and Marco Sigoni. And the other one is titled Evaluation for Equitable Development Results, edited by Marco Sigoni. They provide a lot of detailed approaches on the topic that I think it's useful to read. But finally, drawing from my experience and the literature, I have gathered 7 points that I think I can share with you about the how. One is to focus on understanding how change comes about, not just what happened. I've seen this with many of my colleagues with evaluation when they come to the field, that a lot of things happening in an organization you are working or in certain institution, and that it's really difficult to sometimes have a time to think about the change and what it came from. So this is very important. Second point, and I think it's becoming more crucial in our day of age, is to connect the local to the global and the global to the local. It's not enough now to work in a remote village in anywhere and think that you don't have regional, national, regional, or even international implications. Also recognize complex systems and use appropriate methods. This point about using the complexity methodology and understanding complex system is essential. A lot of us, when we evaluate a project or a program, we focus on this very project or program, but it has also implications for so much more about the program, the policy, the country's relevance, and a lot similar points. Apply systematic anthropogenic analysis. This is something from the Blue Marble evaluation book that talks a lot about the anthropogenic analysis, which I cannot have the time here to explain more about, but the book explains how to use the system and analysis. And basically the Anthropocene, just thinking about that human beings are having a lot of negative consequences on Earth, and this is the time of we living in, and we should be very curious about it and also cautious of it. Focus on inequalities, disaggregated data and contextual factors, for example, socioeconomic and cultural context, power relations. So it's not enough just to follow some evaluation questions without thinking about inequalities, disaggregated data, and even the socioeconomic and cultural context. Many of the TORs we deal with don't sometimes, dig into that, especially when sometimes, unfortunately, program managers think they have weakness in this. Your role as evaluator is to focus on these issues, actually. Be transparent and assertive about what is on stake and involved. This is very important lesson learned from the literature, but also from my experience, that we have to be transparent and we have to be assertive, because there's a lot on stake. And if we shy away or even feel intimidated to express our views as evaluators based on evidence and evaluative thinking, we unfortunately, and the people we're doing the evaluation for, lose a lot. Finally, is to engage and evaluate consistent with the magnitude, direction, and speed of the transformations needed and envisioned. Our board is moving very quickly. There's a lot of things happening, and we need to be as quick, as fast as evaluators as well. This completes my presentation. I think I took exactly 20 minutes, which is perfect. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you as well.
Khalil, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and thank you to our audience for your patience. We're now going to open up today's discussion to questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday talks. You can submit a question in 2 ways. The first is through the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon on your GoToWebinar dashboard. Now that hand icon will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And just to note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME4Peace's media gallery. So those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion. So I'm going to use my moderator's privilege here, Khalil, and I really want to dig into this idea of activism. I think it's worth remembering because we often forget that evaluators are humans too. They see right and wrong, and I think it's really important that while maintaining impartiality, it's important to point out what is right and what is wrong. But impartiality is often seen as key to an evaluator's approach. So I guess my question is, how do we ensure that evaluators maintain impartiality in their work while not restricting their activism? I know you touched on parts of this, but I want to know what we lose from a more activist-based evaluation community compared to what we have now.
Thank you, Jack. This is, I think, is essentially a question and direct to the topic we are talking about. It is also a struggle. It's not easy. And I think I have 10 years of experience now, but maybe some colleagues with 20 or 30 sometimes struggle to give a clear-cut answer for this question. To me, at least from my perspective, from also the literature on the topic, is that we as activists, we don't necessarily compromise the fact that we should also be neutral and impartial, because we have a very good, important tool to use, that is evaluative thinking. And evaluative thinking means that we still are very focusing so much on tools and on evidence, but not as prisoners of these tools and evidence. So when we evaluate certain projects and we notice that there is, for example, the tools we are using does not really cover, some female beneficiaries of the program because of some reason. I mean, here the evaluator role is to speak and doesn't compromise being the fact that you are being also impartial and neutral. There's a fine line, of course, between being activist and take all this stands without evidence. I don't really advocate for that. I think we should always, as evaluators, center around evidence and make sure that when we have the evidence, then we have this activist side of us. Many times I hear from colleagues that, because they go to a project or a program to evaluate, and the project manager, he or she is very sensitive about the project, and I understand, because sometimes they lose their jobs if the evaluation proves that the project was not successful, and hence they hide evidence because they don't want to advocate for issues that maybe this project manager will not like to hear, or his employers. But the problem is, this is exactly against what I'm talking about. What I think is very important is to be not only neutral in this sense, but also accountable to the people we are doing the evaluation for, in terms of who will benefit from it. So in this sense, actually, it becomes more professional, between two brackets, to be really to show this activist side of you and advocate for the different segments of the society that we are talking about. And perhaps one point from the points I have mentioned on the how, is to focus on understanding and the change, really, And if you understand the change, it allows you a lot to really respond to these changes, not based on your values and principles only, but about the change and the complexities of the situation you are evaluating. I hope this answered your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Khalil. And I guess I want to follow up on that. You do a lot of work with young evaluators and young people who are working in evaluation in conflict affected and fragile states. And I guess my question is, obviously your focus on the how and the slides currently on the screen does this a little bit, but what is your top advice for some of the young evaluators who've joined today's discussion on how to straddle a line between activism and evaluation?
Mm-hmm. When we had in the MENA Winter School recently, one evaluator who she started, I think, working 3 years ago in evaluation. But because she works in a project or program where there's a lot of things happening and also a lot of monitoring, you know, she said that one of the presentations that we had today, that day about young evaluators' role in protecting and promoting social justice, that reminded her actually why she became evaluator in the first place. And I really like to say just that, you know, to young evaluators, remember why you really liked the evaluation field. Because you like the accountability and the learning part of it. Maybe it's not helpful to give exact tips about doing this and that because we can do it in the presentation, but the overall is to focus on why you became evaluator. Because many of us wanted to change something. They wanted to contribute at least to change. So this is one of the tips I usually give. But I also, you know, that I focus most of the time also on the issue of really focusing on evidence, not lose the credibility you have as evaluator, basing your argument on evidence. In the whole presentation, when I was talking about the importance of evaluative thinking and action, and also the activist part of it, I always mention that we should focus on evidence. Because once as an evaluator, you start basing your opinions without evidence, this is the problem. But many times, again, you know, you notice that evidence can be used in different ways, and people can use it to prove some point or the opposite. And it gets more tricky. So one piece of advice I have when people ask me is to speak to other young emerging evaluators, to more seasoned evaluators, to always learn from the literature we have. A lot of people, and myself not excluded, you know, because our field has a lot of new literature and books, and sometimes it's hard to cope. So a lot of people still, you know, study evaluation from very traditional way, focusing on quantitative or qualitative. In the Arab world, in MENA countries, there's a lot of discussion about taqyim or taqwim, which is basically very similar words, but you know, it's discussion about the exact wording of the word evaluation. Or you see some people who study or, you know, started with a theory of change or certain quantitative method, and they focus so much on it. What I am saying in this presentation, and what I tell young evaluators in general that I work with, is to try to look at the global perspective, not always the detail where for certain method or certain technique, and forget the overall picture.
Great, thank you, Khalil. I think that's a fantastic answer on the first point about people skewing evidence to make it work for them. I'm reminded of of a quote from Samuel Johnson saying that there are 3 kinds of lies. The first is lies, the second is damn lies, and the third is statistics. So we can skew anything to make it work. And I think you touched on the crux of, I think, the important dichotomy here between evaluation and activism is critical thinking and evidence-based approaches. And I think that's something important to take away. We have a great question now from Jeremy from the STEAM working group. And Jeremy writes, have you found that taking this, and he said, highly appropriate stance reduces partners and funders' willingness to help with the practical need for resources? So have you had any pushback from funders or partners because of this approach?
Yes, I think almost not only me, but every evaluator who focuses on these issues and try to sometimes to look beyond what exactly the TOR, the terms of reference, or the evaluation question set by the evaluation manager. Perhaps, you know, some evaluation manager in certain organization who is very good in producing these TORs and having the evaluation question, but maybe they themselves never really went to the field and did evaluation. And often, especially when you are young and emerging evaluators, you have a lot of pushback because they expect you to follow exactly how the TOR is saying in terms of methodology, in terms of question, in terms of criteria. And there is an obsession almost in the evaluation community with the DAC criteria for evaluation. And if you try to use other criteria or think beyond this criteria, sometimes it's difficult. But this is not to say that everyone is the same. There are some organizations and some individuals at organizations that actually support you and really like this approach, and they will go and do everything for you to successfully do it because they really care, because they see that you are as an evaluators coming to help them. You don't have in mind before going to a program or a project that you're going to destroy it. You know, you are there to help. So they nourish this and they support you. And in my experience, the best experiences are actually when you have this combination. Of course, we don't live in a perfect world, but when it happens and you have managers who understand and actually nourish this idea, they focus on the learning part. So as many of you perhaps know, the evaluation function in general or the profession overall has two main functions really for most programs, project, even interventions in the policy level. First is the accountability part, that is doing the reports for the donors or for the government, for the parliament and so on. And there's the learning part. And I think both are very important. But as an evaluator also, I see the value in the learning part, because if all the funder or the commissioner or the client in the evaluation is on the accountability part, it's a problem. And most of the time, if you have any critical findings and evidence showing that things are not working, they don't like it. But if the client or commissioner is aware of both functions and really has the intention to learn through your evaluation, then they work with you very well. And finally, it's not to say that somebody you work with and this is, you know, this is black or white, left or right. Actually, it's also as an evaluator, as a facilitator. You are a negotiator. You go to a program or a project and you evaluate it, but you also have to have the right language to speak to the client. And even when you have negative findings, you should communicate them in a good diplomatic way, but not compromise your findings. The problem is when you communicate some ideas in a way that the client will not accept it. You are not serving the purpose. So I practice myself, and I also advise others when they ask, is even if you find something that is failing about the project, what can you do to help? If you go and say it's failing, okay, the main idea of evaluator is not to say something is failing or not failing, is to say how, why it failed, how can you help? So yeah, so this is, I think, you know, very important in terms of dealing with different types of commissioners.
So Khalil, I think you touched on something that our next question from Melissa Martinez gets at, and it's that idea that we don't live in a perfect world. So how do activist evaluators deal with the power of inequality of speaking truth to power while protecting their employability by clients who might be embarrassed or possibly angry at a critical challenge? What tactics do you find useful, especially for young and emerging evaluators?
This is an excellent question, and it's very realistic, and this is what happens with us on a daily basis. My approach, at least from my experience, I saw that when you start to be an evaluator, especially when you're young, people will not listen to you easily. They will perhaps even push back on everything you say. But if you are coming to a project or a program to evaluate, but really read all the materials about the project before, and you're already well prepared in terms of literature, and you read beyond just, you know, theory of change and the qualitative methods, this one or that, you know, but you have a perspective on the different new ideas and thoughts in evaluation. If you also really care about what you say, because, you know, sometimes if you work especially as an evaluator and start in the beginning as a consultant, it's hard when you have 2-3 projects to refuse one, because you say, oh, I'm working as a consultant and it's very important for me to take more than one project. But sometimes you have to say no, that you focus only on 1 or 2 because you have to focus and work on them very hard and read all the materials. And slowly but steadily, I felt, at least from my experience, when people see that you do that, when you're genuine about what you're doing, when you care about the program, when you want to do the field research in a thorough way, so people start to listen to you. People start to see that you are credible about what you're saying. You're not doing it for the money. You're not doing it for, I don't know, for the fame, for the right, to write an article about. You really want to help. You're coming there because you care. People start to listen to you with the client, and maybe this is a little bit disappointing, but sometimes some people can never change. Some projects can never change. You will do your best. You'll submit the best report in your view. You will read all the materials, but they won't change. This is one of the things that I really never kind of sorted out in my mind what I feel about. I feel upset about it, but I know that I have very little control. When you do everything, you submit to the project, and they never do any change based on the findings you did. And the findings are not yours, are based on what you found out on the in the field. So the problem here is about maybe their managers, the learning culture in the organization. And it's true, it's not a perfect word, and here it will be very difficult to do. But when you also work with different organizations, you kind of see trends. And another really dilemma one has, you know, when you start working with organization, you see this organization is kind of weak. It needs help more than the others. But at the same time, also management-wise, it's weak, and it's very difficult for them to really take what they learn from you and really utilize it. What do? You go to the organization that is successful and will take your evaluation reports so easily because they have very good systems in place, or you go to the other one that they will struggle a little bit even adopting your recommendations after that based on the evidence and the research. But, you know, there's a room for, they need more help. This is also another dilemma, one not easily find answer to. But I agree with you 100%. The world is not perfect at all.
So Khalil, just a couple of things that you brought up there. The first is a strong learning organization is key to taking the results from an evaluation and using it to amplify the impact of a project or change the direction of a project to make the greatest positive impact. And I think our next question from Cecilia Demi, sorry Cecilia if I've mispronounced your name, hits on that. So Cecilia writes, Khalil, more and more voices are advocating for applying a systems thinking approach and looking for unintended consequences. This implies using developmental evaluation methods. Do you think developmental evaluation and participatory evaluation should be prioritized over other methods?
The answer is simply, from my point of view, is yes, yes, yes. We need system thinking. We need participatory approach. But I don't like the part that, you know, prioritize it over other methods. Because, you know, one of the books we discussed today about blue marble evaluation says just that, you know, you see the complexity of the world, transformation the world is going through, the great challenges that we are seeing. Without system thinking, without complexity theory, we really cannot do anything. Without participation as well, when we engage with with the beneficiaries or people benefiting from the program, it's also very difficult. But I also don't want or don't like usually to stick to certain methods. As an evaluator, you have a toolbox of so many different methods, like a lot of other professions. Sometimes the tool is best for fixing something. You should use it. Some other times, other tool is useful. What I feel as a profession, we have always a tendency to want to use certain methods or certain approach. I say system thinking, participatory, developmental evaluations are all in our toolbox that we should make use of, depending on the situation that we are working on. And this is one of the points when we talk about, recognize complex systems and use appropriate methods, not recognize complex system and use complexity theory or complexity thinking, because maybe it's not the best approach there.
I think that's a really important point, is that there is no catch-all for evaluation. We should be doing evaluations that are contextually specific, that are conflict sensitive and appropriate for the program that we're specifically working on. I also think that Khalil, you touched on a really good point of it all depends on the circumstances as well. Participatory evaluation and developmental evaluation will be great tools to use, but it depends on the context. It also depends on the resources you have at hand. Embedding an evaluation or project from day one is a very expensive process. So not every project is going to be able to do that. But there are ways of building in feedback mechanisms and learning loops that allow you to recognize shifts that will allow you to make better decisions in your programming moving forward. Next question comes from Jackie Yipton. And Jackie is an independent consultant. And this question, I think, was quite funny, so I think it's one of a good one to start rounding up on. And Jackie writes, Khalil, you are addressing emerging evaluators. What is your message for older evaluators? Do you find that they are not activist enough?
Yes, this is a really good question too. Thank you, Jackie. I think from the presentation, if you saw, I talk a little bit about youth in general at some point as well. At least I feel that youth that are working in evaluation, young and emerging evaluators, they have the tendency to want to have this activist hat, and that they see it as not as a problem, because they think you can be activist and rigorous at the same time. But in our field, I see that some evaluators, following again, certain methods from before and sticking to them, they think that, you should be rigorous in the sense that you are neutral as an evaluator, you're partial, you should not have this approach as an activist at all. But to be honest with you, I feel, I can mention or you can read most of the authors in evaluation that a lot of people are reading now. They are very progressive, and they move so much beyond, this point, and they think it is a need more than anything. Now, the problem, I think, with older evaluation or even young evaluators that are not connected to others, this is the problem. When you're an evaluator and you did not attend the conference for example, for the past 5 years, and not necessarily because you don't have the resources. Sometimes your organization even offer you resources, but you're not connecting with other colleagues. Or the last book you read about evaluation 3 years ago, and you had the training one time 10 years ago, which was comprehensive, but it's 10 years ago. It's the connectedness that I think we have as young emerging evaluators is very important. People are connected to each other, so they share the ideas with each other. And also the global perspective. I mean, for our generation now, I think there is more tendency to understand how the world is really connected in amazing way. I see, for example, our colleagues in different networks and everything. Sometimes they struggle a little bit to see how EvalYouth, for example, we have 4 different task forces, and how the task forces are working really from 4 or 5 different continents all the time, and working so efficiently, and the communication channels, in different ways that are, so for other evaluators, they find it very difficult even to to see how it happens. So I think it's not about just the thinking that it's old or they don't like to be activists. I think it's not seeing the global perspective and not seeing how they can contribute to this global perspective, maybe contribute to this issue. And when I talk, as Jackie asked, to older evaluators, people who have been having a lot of experience, I actually do share EvalYouth experience. I share my own experience. I share my colleagues' experience about examples, how we said no to certain evaluation or certain outcome or so, because out of principle, because we think we should advocate for certain segment of the society. And you know, you can always breach people and say, oh, this is what you should, but when you do it by example, when you really stand to things you believe in and do it, so much louder, so much more important than just saying you should do this, and you yourself don't do it at some point. It's a struggle, but I think it's very important for our field to function this way and to be aware of these issues.
Well, that is time for today. Khalil, thank you so much for a brilliant presentation and a great Q&A. To our audience, I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions. You asked so many great ones, but I hope that you took something from this discussion. I know I really enjoyed it, and it's really exciting to see this new interconnected generation of evaluators take us forward to embrace this critical thinking, evaluative approach, and look to make the greatest positive impact possible. It's really exciting, and I know that the work of EvalYouth, the work of EvalMina, of the voluntary organizations of professional evaluators around the world, of DME for Peace, we're excited to continue to share knowledge, to foster that interconnectedness, and to make sure that we're addressing things appropriately. Thanks to everyone for joining this final edition of the M&E Thursday Talks for 2019, and thank you for joining every Thursday Talk that you've joined throughout the decade. For those of you that know, this recording will be posted on our media gallery later today, so please feel free to return to it and share it with your colleagues. And please feel free to continue the discussion in the comments. DME for Peace is accessed by hundreds of thousands of users from 191 countries, and we all learn from each other, so please feel free to keep that learning going. And with that, I want to say thank you again to Khalil, and I wish everybody a happy holiday season. We're going to be back in 2020, bigger, better, and badder than ever, with more quirky evaluation content, and we look forward to continue that discussion with you. We look forward to continue learning with you, and I hope everyone has a safe and peaceful holiday period. Happy New Year, and see you in 2020.
Thank you, Jack, and happy holidays to everybody. Bye-bye.